In South Korea, you can be born in a Samsung hospital, grow up in a Samsung apartment, study on a Samsung scholarship, work in a Samsung tower, insure your life with Samsung, and one day be buried through a Samsung funeral service. One company touches a South Korean life from the first breath to the last. Add up everything it makes: the phones, the chips, the ships, the insurance, the construction, and it comes to roughly a fifth of the entire country's economy. So you'd assume the family that runs it owns most of it. They don't. They own less than 5%. One family gives the orders across an empire worth a fifth of a nation, while holding a sliver most people would call a minority stake in a single company. And it's not an accident. It's the most quietly brilliant thing they ever built. I'm Daniel, and this is Asian Money Map, where we dig into the empires, the billionaire families, and the real money behind Asia. If you want the story underneath the headline number, you're in the right place. Because the Samsung story everyone tells you is about phones versus Apple and chips versus Taiwan. The real one is about how 5% quietly rules the whole thing. Here is the puzzle I want to solve today. How does a family that owns under 5% of the crown jewel control the entire empire around it? And once you see how, a second question gets uncomfortable. When one company is a fifth of a country, who actually controls whom? The family or the nation? To understand Asia, follow the money. But to understand Asian money, follow the family. And this family is a masterclass. It did not start with chips. It started with dried fish. In 1938, in the city of Daegu, a young man named Lee Byung-chul opened a small trading shop. 30,000 won of capital, about 40 staff. The business was simple: buy up local dried fish, vegetables, and noodles, and export them across the border to China. He called it Samsung 3 stars, a name meant to sound big, strong, and eternal. At the time, it sold groceries. Then Korea got torn apart by colonization, by war, by poverty, and rebuilt at breakneck speed. And Lee Byung-chul rode every wave of that rebuild: sugar refining, wool, insurance, fertilizer. Then, in 1969, the move that would matter most: electronics. For a while, Samsung Electronics meant cheap. Cheap TVs, cheap microwaves, the budget stuff nobody bragged about. And that's where the second man in this story loses his patience. In 1993, Lee Byung-chul's son, Lee Kun-hee, flew a couple hundred of his top executives to a hotel in Frankfurt, sat them down, and delivered a line that is now legend in Korean business. Change everything, he told them. Everything except your wife and kids. Stop chasing quantity. Chase quality, or stay second-rate forever. To make the point land, 2 years later, he had a pile of 150,000 defective Samsung phones stacked in a factory yard and set on fire while the workers who made them watched. It worked. From that turn onward, the value of the Samsung group multiplied roughly 200 times over the next 3 decades. The bargain bin brand became the company that outshipped Sony, outsold almost everyone, and ended up making the one component the entire modern world runs on. And it kept sprawling sideways. Today, Samsung isn't one company. It's dozens, tangled under a single name. Samsung Heavy Industries welds some of the largest cargo ships and oil tankers on the ocean. Samsung's construction arm helped raise the tallest building on Earth, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. Add Samsung Life Insurance, Samsung Biologics, luxury hotels, and Everland, the country's biggest theme park. That's what Koreans mean by the Republic of Samsung. One family's group, woven into nearly every corner of a national life. So where does the money actually come from today? Not where you'd think. Everyone pictures the Galaxy phone. But the real engine sits one layer down, inside almost every phone and server and laptop on Earth: memory chips. Samsung is the largest memory maker in the world. There are 2 kinds that matter: DRAM, the working memory that lets your phone or a server think in the moment, where Samsung holds around half the entire global market, and NAND flash, the storage that remembers your photos when the power's off, where it's also number 1. Put simply, a huge share of the world's devices, including ones built by Samsung's own rivals, think and remember on Samsung silicon. And memory is a strange, violent business. It runs on brutal cycles. When there's a glut, prices collapse and the factories bleed for a year. When demand outruns supply, prices scream upward and the same factories print money. The trick is that Samsung has the scale and the war chest to keep building through the busts, so it's still standing at full capacity when the boom returns. 2024 was a boom, and the reason was artificial intelligence. Every AI data center is ravenous for memory, and that demand sent chip prices flying. Samsung Electronics pulled in about $228 billion in revenue that year, and net profit more than doubled to around $25 billion. The Galaxy phone in your hand is the visible half of Samsung. The invisible half, the chips, is where the real money is made. And there's a newest, most precious kind of memory worth knowing by name: high bandwidth memory, the stack of chips that sits right beside the processors training AI. In this boom, it became the most valuable sand on the planet. Hold that thought, because when we get to what could actually hurt this empire, that little detail comes back with a twist. But watch me carefully here, because this is the trap most people fall into. They spend the whole Samsung debate arguing about the machine. Can it beat Taiwan's chipmakers? Can the phone beat the iPhone? Important questions. Wrong ones for understanding this family. Because the family's real masterpiece was never a product. It was the thing wrapped around the machine. The ownership. Let me draw you the map, because the structure is the whole story. Start with the number that shouldn't work. The Lee family owns less than 5% of Samsung Electronics, the company that is Samsung to most of the world. 5% does not control anything. So how do they command it? The answer is a loop. Korean conglomerates like Samsung are called Chaebol, and the signature of a Chaebol is the circular shareholding, a web where the group's companies own pieces of each other in a ring. Company A owns a chunk of Company B, which owns a chunk of Company C, which owns a chunk of Company A. Because the companies hold each other, the family doesn't have to hold much of any of them. They only have to control the one door the whole loop hangs from. For Samsung, that door is a company called Samsung C&T. On paper, it does construction and trading. In reality, it's the keystone, JY. Lee, the grandson, the man who runs Samsung today, personally owns about 22% of Samsung C&T. And Samsung C&T, together with Samsung Life Insurance, holds the decisive stakes in Samsung Electronics. Samsung Life alone sits on around 7.5% of electronics. Samsung C&T holds another chunk on top. So the family's tiny 2% personal slice of electronics never has to stand on its own. It's the last link in a chain, and a 22% grip on the one keystone company controls that chain end to end. 2% amplified into command. That's the machine that matters, and it's exactly the structure that Korea's own regulators have spent years trying to force the Chaebol to unwind, because a loop like this lets a family rule vast public companies with other people's money. Every attempt to break it has been fought, slowed, and survived. And now you understand why one boardroom deal in 2015 became the most important and most explosive event in modern Korean business. That year, Samsung merged two of its companies, an outfit called Chaebol Industries, where the heir's ownership was concentrated, into Samsung C&T, the keystone. Merge them on the right terms, and JY. Lee's grip on the whole empire locks into place, conveniently, right as his father lay incapacitated after a heart attack. The terms offered 3 shares of C&T for a single share of Chaebol. A ratio critics said deliberately shortchanged C&T's shareholders to hand the family control on the cheap. A New York hedge fund, Elliott, held a big stake in C&T and fought the deal in public. The vote was close, and it swung when South Korea's National Pension Fund, the retirement savings of ordinary Koreans, voted in favor. That vote is where the story turns dark, because prosecutors later found the president of South Korea herself had leaned on that pension fund to back the family. And here's the detail you couldn't script. The president was Park Kun-hee, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, the very general who had built the whole Chaebol system decades earlier. The system her father created came back to swallow her. The bribe went to a shadowy confidant of the president named Choi Soon-sil, who held no office but had the president's ear. And the most Samsung part of the whole scandal: Some of that money bought championship dressage horses for Choi's daughter to ride. Jae Lee was convicted of bribing the president's circle to grease the deal that cemented his own control. He served 18 months. The fallout was enormous. Millions of Koreans poured into the streets, week after week holding candles, until the president was impeached and removed from office. Think about what that means. The ordinary machinery of Korean democracy, its courts, and its protesters, reached all the way up and toppled a sitting president over a deal designed to tighten one family's grip on one company. And yet the family kept the grip. The machine that let 5% rule the empire had at its very center a crime that brought down a president and still held. Now step back, because to a Western viewer this looks insane. And it isn't, once you see the bargain underneath it. After the war, South Korea was one of the poorest places on Earth, poorer than much of Africa, with almost no industry to speak of. In the 1960s and 70s, its government, under a military strongman, made a deliberate and ruthless deal. It took a handful of family conglomerates and fed them cheap loans, protection from foreign competition, and first pick of every opportunity. In return, it demanded one thing: build a real export economy out of nothing and build it fast. The Chaebol are the children of that deal. In 2 generations, they turned a broken country into a top-tier industrial power, the so-called Miracle on the Han River. Concentrated family power was the price Korea agreed to pay for that miracle, and Samsung is the bargain's greatest success, which is why Koreans have such a knotted relationship with it. There's genuine national pride. Samsung is the flag Korea plants on the world stage. And there's real resentment of the dynasty, the privilege, the sense that the rules bend around one family. You see that bend most clearly in what happens after a Chaebol boss is convicted. They tend to get pardoned. Jae-yong Lee served his time and was paroled. And then something very telling happened. While he sat sidelined, the world fell into a semiconductor shortage and a US-China chip war, and Samsung is one of only a handful of companies on Earth that can build the most advanced chips. But competing there means approving factories that cost $15 to $20 billion each. Under the Chaebol model, professional executives run the day-to-day, but a bet that size needs the family's signature. With the heir in legal limbo, ministers and business leaders started warning that Samsung was moving too slowly, and a slow Samsung means a slow Korea. So in 2022, the president pardoned him outright, and the official reason was blunt. The country needed him to overcome a national economic crisis. To an outsider, the reads as impunity: commit the crime, get let out to run the company anyway. Inside Korea, it's the uneasy other half of the bargain. When one family's decisions move a fifth of your GDP, a country flinches at actually locking them away. Too big to fail is a phrase we all know. This is too big to jail. So what could finally loosen a grip this well-built? Not a competitor, something quieter. And it's already happening. When Kun-hee, the man who burned the phones, died in 2020, he left an estate worth around $23 billion. And South Korea runs one of the highest inheritance taxes on the planet, a top rate of 50%, and for the controlling shares of a major company, a premium that pushes it towards 60%. The policy is built precisely to stop dynasties from compounding forever. The Lee family's bill came to roughly $11 billion, the largest inheritance tax in the country's history, more than 3 times what the entire nation collects in estate tax in a normal year. They're paying it in installments, over years. They've sold real estate. They donated 23,000 artworks, Picassos, a Monet, a Dali, partly to soften the blow. But the part that actually threatens the empire is simpler than any of that. To pay a tax bill that size, the family has to sell shares. And the shares they hold are the very shares that give them control. Every block handed to the taxman thins the grip. Years into the payments, the family is still filing to sell more of its Samsung stock to cover the installments. The state's tax and the dynasty's power are now pulling against each other in slow motion, and in that contest, the tax always gets paid. Layer on top the steady regulatory push to force Chaebol to unwind those circular shareholdings, and you have the real long-term risk to Samsung. Not a better phone from a rival. A thread being pulled from 2 directions at once, patiently, for years. And the concentration cuts both ways. When one company is this large a share of a national economy, the whole country rises and falls on its chip cycle. In one recent year, analysts reckon Samsung alone could account for something like half of South Korea's economic growth. A nation that depends on one family that heavily has handed that family enormous power and taken on enormous risk in return. And just to keep them honest, the machine stumbled too. Samsung, the memory king, was slow on the one memory that suddenly mattered most, the high-bandwidth memory that sits beside the chips training artificial intelligence. Its smaller rival, SK Hynix, got there first and won the prize customer. The king had to chase the challenger to catch up. It did catch up. But the most important new market in its own backyard? It lost the first round of. So here's my take. Strip away the phones and the chips and the horse race headlines, and the Lee family's genius was never engineering silicon. It was engineering ownership. They built a structure where a 2% stake run through one keystone company and a loop of cross-holdings commands an empire that is a fifth of a national economy. That is not luck, and it's not a product. It's a financial machine as sophisticated as anything they ever fabricated in a chip plant, and far more durable. Which tells you where the real danger is, and it's not where the cameras point. Samsung will win some chip cycles and lose others. That's just weather. The thing that could actually break the family's hold isn't NVIDIA or a Taiwanese foundry. It's an inheritance tax bill and a financial regulator. Two forces with no interest in phones at all, quietly pulling on the one thread the whole structure hangs from. And the deepest question the Samsung story leaves you with is the one Koreans live with every day. When a single family, through 5% and a clever loop, sits atop a fifth of your economy, one that can convict its leader and then decide it can't afford to keep him locked up, you have to ask, who is really steering whom? The family runs the company. The company runs the country's fortunes. So does the country run the family? Nobody in Seoul is quite sure of the answer. Here's what I keep coming back to. We spend so much time asking whether Samsung makes the best chip or the best phone. But that was never the point of building it this way. You don't wire an empire through cross-shareholdings in a keystone company to make better electronics. You do it to make control cheap and permanent, to own the outcome without owning the assets. That's the pattern under so much Asian money, and Samsung is its purest example. The goal isn't to own the most. It's to control the whole while owning the least and to make sure the family stays at the top no matter who's technically holding the shares. So the next time you read that Samsung stock jumped or its profit fell, remember, that's just the machine. The real story is the loop wrapped around it, and the tax bill slowly, patiently pulling it apart. If you like following the money until it leads somewhere you didn't expect, the families, the empires, the quiet structures behind Asia's biggest names, subscribe. There's a whole map to work through, and we're only getting started. And tell me in the comments, when one family this powerful can be convicted and then pardoned for the economy, is that a country protecting its champion? Or a champion that's outgrown its country? I read every one.